The sacred moon of Varethka hung in the darkness of space like a pale jewel against black velvet, and upon its surface stood the temple of first light where pilgrims from 1,000 worlds had gathered for the quincentennial ceremony of worthiness. Yunseoa stepped off the transport shuttle and felt the thin air fill her lungs as she looked up at the ancient structure that rose from the barren landscape like a monument to forgotten gods, its spires reaching toward the stars that had watched over it for 12,000 years. She was nobody important, just a cultural attach assigned to the human delegation as an afterthought. And she knew that her species remained little more than a curiosity to the elder races of the Galactic Concord ambassador Cho Min-jae walked beside her with the measured steps of a diplomat who had spent decades navigating the complex politics of interstellar relations. And he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Stay close and observe everything," he said quietly. "This ceremony happens only once every 500 years, and you are witnessing history." The temple entrance loomed before them, carved from stone so ancient that the writing upon its surface had worn away to mere suggestions of meaning, and guards in ceremonial armor flanked the massive doors. These were the Kethrani, a warrior species who had guarded this place for generations beyond counting. Their scaled bodies covered in ritual scarification that told the stories of their ancestors. Prime Ascendant Velthorix stood at the threshold, his yellow eyes scanning each delegation as they arrived. And when his gaze fell upon the humans, he made no effort to hide his dismissal. "The young ones from Earth," he announced in a voice that carried across the courtyard, "come to watch their betters attempt what they could never hope to achieve." Sioha felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But Ambassador Cho simply offered a respectful bow and led their small group inside without responding to the insult. The interior of the temple took her breath away in ways she had not expected, for the walls seemed to glow with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and the ceiling stretched so high above that it disappeared into shadow. At the center of the vast chamber stood a pedestal of black stone, and upon it rested the Blade of Unification. Sioha had seen images of the legendary sword in her research files, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of its presence. For the weapon seemed to pull at something deep within her chest like a magnet drawing iron filings toward itself. The blade was neither large nor ornate, just a simple length of metal with a wrapped handle that looked almost ordinary compared to the ceremonial weapons carried by the Kethrani guards. Yet it commanded the attention of every being in the room. The architects forged this blade before our ancestors crawled from the primordial seas of our homeworld, Velthorix proclaimed as he took his position beside the pedestal. They left it here with a promise that one day a worthy soul would lift it and bring unity to a fractured galaxy. Representatives from dozens of species filled the chamber, their bodies displaying every imaginable variation of evolution. And Sioha found herself pressed against the back wall where the human delegation had been assigned to stand. A massive creature covered in crystalline plates approached the pedestal first, its movements shaking the floor with each step. And when it wrapped its appendages around the sword's handle, the muscles beneath its armor bulged with tremendous effort. The blade did not move. Gasps and murmurs filled the chamber as the creature strained against the immovable weapon, and after several moments, it released its grip and stepped back with what might have been shame darkening its features. One by one, the representatives came forward to try their strength against the ancient sword, and one by one they failed to move it even the slightest amount. Sioha watched a being of pure energy attempt to phase through the blade and lift it from within. But the sword rejected even this approach, and the entity recoiled as if burned. She watched a collective intelligence comprising thousands of tiny organisms work together in perfect coordination. Their combined strength focused on the single task of raising the weapon. But still, the blade remained fixed to its pedestal, Hours passed, and the ceremony continued as species after species approached with confidence and departed in defeat. Their ancient pride wounded by their failure to accomplish what none had accomplished in 12 millennia, the Kathrani themselves sent their greatest warriors to attempt the lift. And even Velthorix himself wrapped his scarred hands around the handle and pulled with all the strength his powerful body could generate. Nothing happened. The sword still waits. Velthorix announced as the ceremony drew to its close. As it has waited since the architects departed this realm. And as it will wait until one worthy of its power finally appears, the delegations began to file out of the chamber, their voices mixing in conversations that ranged from philosophical debate to barely concealed relief that no rival species had succeeded. Where they had failed, Ambassador Cho touched Sioa's arm and nodded toward the exit. But she found herself unable to move, her eyes fixed upon the sword that rested so peacefully upon its ancient pedestal. "I will catch up," she said softly. And the ambassador studied her face for a moment before nodding and leaving her alone in the emptying chamber. The last of the pilgrims departed, and the Kathrani guards took their positions at the doors, paying no attention to the insignificant human who lingered near the back wall. Sioha did not understand what drew her forward, only that her feet carried her across the stone floor without her conscious decision. And before she fully realized what she was doing, she stood before the blade of unification. The sword seemed smaller up close, almost ordinary, and she wondered how something so simple could have defeated so many powerful beings. She thought about all the mighty creatures who had tried and failed, all the ancient races with their superior strength and technology and wisdom. And she knew with absolute certainty that she had no chance of succeeding where they had not. But her hand reached out anyway. Her fingers wrapped around the handle, and the leather felt warm against her palm, worn smooth by countless hands across countless centuries. And she pulled upward without any real expectation that anything would happen. Light exploded through the temple. The sword rose from its pedestal as easily as if it had been waiting for her touch. And Sioha stumbled backward in shock as the blade sang with a tone that resonated in her bones and echoed off the ancient walls. The Kathrani guards spun toward her with weapons raised, their eyes wide with an emotion she had never seen on their fierce faces. Fierce Sioha stood in the center of the temple first, light with the blade of unification held in her trembling hands. And she understood that nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again. The guards were shouting, and alarms were sounding throughout the temple complex. But all she could do was stare at the weapon that had chosen her when it had rejected every other being who had ever attempted to lift it. She was nobody important. Just a human, just a cultural attached from a species that had joined the Galactic Concord only 30 years ago, and somehow she had done the impossible. The broadcast chamber hummed with energy as holographic displays showed the transmission, spreading across the galaxy like ripples in a cosmic pond. And Sioha stood before the array with the sword in her bleeding hands, while billions of eyes watched from unimaginable distances. Grantax froze in the doorway as he realized what had happened. His weapon still raised, but his certainty suddenly shaken by the knowledge that killing her now would be witnessed by every species in the Concord. "You foolish creature," he snarled. "Do you think this changes anything?" Sioha turned to face the broadcast array and took a deep breath, knowing that whatever she said in this moment would echo across history. "My name is Yun Sioha," she began, her voice rough with pain but steady with conviction. "I am human, and I am nobody important." She held up the sword so that every being watching could see it clearly. "A few hours ago, I lifted this blade when no other being could. And I have spent every moment since then trying to understand why it chose me." Grantax moved closer, his eyes darting between Sioha and the displays that showed her image being received on world after world. "I did not believe I could lift it," Sioha continued. "I knew with absolute certainty that I would fail just as every other being had failed for 12,000 years. And yet I reached for it anyway. She thought of Nazith and hoped the old scholar was somehow still alive to hear these words. The architects who created this sword were searching for something specific, she said. Not the strongest or the wisest or the most pure, but something much simpler and much rarer. She lowered the blade and looked directly into the broadcast array. They were looking for someone who would try without knowing they would succeed. Someone who would reach for the impossible simply because reaching mattered more than succeeding. Across the galaxy, beings of every species leaned closer to their screens and listened to the small humans speak. I am told that most species in the Concord have evolved beyond this capacity, Sioha said. That you calculate your chances before you act. That you only attempt things you believe you can accomplish. That is wisdom. Granthax interrupted loudly. That is the foundation of civilization. Perhaps, Sioha acknowledged, but it is also a cage. A limitation that prevents you from ever exceeding your own expectations of yourselves. She raised the sword again and felt its warmth pulse against her palm like a heartbeat. Humans are different, she said. We dream of things we know are impossible, and then we spend our lives trying to achieve them anyway. We fall in love with people who might never love us back. We start businesses that might fail. We write songs that might never be heard. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. We climb mountains because they are there. We cross oceans without knowing what lies on the other side. We look at the stars and say, maybe. Even when every calculation tells us no. This is weakness, Granthax insisted. But his voice had lost some of its certainty. This is hope, Sioha replied. And I think the architects understood that hope is what moves the universe forward. Not certainty. She took a step toward Granthax and watched him instinctively step back despite his superior size and strength. I do not claim to be a chosen one, she said. I do not claim to be destined for greatness or anointed by ancient gods. I am just a human who reached for something without knowing whether she could grasp it. She walked to the pedestal that stood at the center of the broadcast chamber, a twin of the one in the main temple, and she placed the blade of unification upon its surface. I will not keep this sword, she announced. And gasps echoed from the displays as viewers across the galaxy reacted to her words. Instead, I leave it here with a challenge for every being watching. She continued. Stop calculating your chances. Stop limiting yourselves to what you know you can achieve. Reach for something impossible today. She stepped back from the pedestal and faced the array one final time. The architects did not leave this sword to crown a ruler, she said. They left it to remind us that the universe rewards those who try. Even when trying seems foolish, even when failure seems certain. She turned to face Granthax, who stood frozen with his weapon lowered and his expression unreadable. You can kill me now, she said calmly, but you cannot kill what I represent. You cannot kill the hope that every being watching this broadcast is feeling in their hearts. Granthax stared at her for a long moment, and Sioha saw something shift behind his yellow eyes. Some ancient certainty cracking under the weight of her words behind him. Kethrani warriors filled the doorway, but they made no move to attack. Their attention fixed on the displays that showed their world watching. Lower your weapon, Warlord, a familiar voice commanded. And Nazith limped into view with blood staining her robes, but life still burning in her eyes. The prophecy has been fulfilled in a way none of us expected, and we must accept what the architects have shown us. Granthax looked at the sword on its pedestal, at the human who had returned it willingly, at the billions of beings watching from across the galaxy, and slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his weapon. Ambassador Cho pushed through the crowd and rushed to Sioha's side, his face pale with relief and something that might have been pride. You did it, he whispered. You changed everything. Sioha leaned against him as exhaustion finally overwhelmed her defiance. I just reached for something, she murmured. The same thing humans have always done. Outside the temple, Dawn was breaking over Varthka, and across the galaxy, beings of every species were looking at themselves with new eyes. The blade of unification rested on its pedestal as it had rested for 12,000 years, waiting for the next being brave enough to reach for the impossible. But something had changed. For the first time since the architects departed, others were lining up to try, not because they believed they would succeed, but because a small human had shown them that success was never the point. The reaching was what mattered, and humans had always known how to reach. The passage twisted through the bowels of the temple like a serpent carved from living stone, and Sioha moved through the darkness with one hand on the wall and the other gripping the blade of unification. Nazith followed close behind with two of her loyal guards, their breathing heavy in the confined space as they navigated by the faint glow that emanated from the sword itself. "How much further?" Sioha whispered. "The broadcast chamber lies at the heart of the temple," Nazith replied. "We must pass through the Hall of Remembrance to reach it." They emerged from the passage into a vast underground space that took Sioha's breath away, for the walls were covered with images of beings she had never seen before. Tall and graceful figures with features that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. "The architects," Nazith said reverently. "This is the only place in the galaxy where their true forms were recorded." Sioha paused before one of the images and felt a strange recognition stir in her chest, as if she was looking at something she had always known but forgotten. "They look sad," she said. "They were," Nazith replied. "The texts speak of a great melancholy that consumed them in their final days, a longing for something they could no longer experience, uncertainty, and the joy that comes with it," Nazith confirmed. "The thrill of not knowing what will happen next, the excitement of possibility, the courage required to face the unknown." Sounds of pursuit echoed from somewhere behind them, and the guards urged them forward with desperate gestures. They ran through the Hall of Remembrance and into another passage that climbed upward toward the surface. And Sioha felt her legs burning with the effort as she pushed herself to keep moving. A voice rang out ahead of them, and suddenly they found themselves facing a group of Kethrani warriors who blocked the passage with weapons raised. "Surrender the human and the blade," the lead warrior commanded, "and you will be granted mercy." "Stand aside," Nazith replied with authority in her voice. "I am the High Keeper, and you have no right to impede me." "Granthax has declared you a traitor," the warrior said. "Your titles mean nothing now." One of Nazith's guards moved forward to engage the enemy warriors, and Sioha watched in horror as combat erupted in the narrow passage. She had never witnessed violence like this. The brutal efficiency of Kethrani warriors fighting to the death in a space so confined that there was no room for retreat or surrender. The guard fell with a cry, and the enemy warriors advanced over his body with blood on their blades. "Run," Nazith shouted as she pushed Sioha toward a side passage. "I will hold them as long as I can." "No," Sioha protested. "I will not leave you. You carry the sword," Nazith said fiercely. "You carry the hope of the entire galaxy, and you must reach the broadcast chamber no matter the cost." The remaining loyal guard grabbed Sioha's arm and dragged her into the side passage as Nazith turned to face the advancing warriors with nothing but her frail body and her unshakable faith. Sioha heard the sounds of fighting behind her as she ran, and she felt tears streaming down her face as she imagined what was happening to the old scholar who had been the only one willing to believe in her. The passage opened into a larger corridor, and she recognized the architecture as part of the main temple complex, which meant they were close to the broadcast chamber. "This way," the guard said. But his words were cut short as an energy blast struck him in the chest, and he collapsed to the floor. Sioha spun to see Warlord Granthax emerging from the shadows with a weapon still smoking in his hand and a Smile of cruel satisfaction on his scarred face. The chase ends here. Human, he said, as he approached with slow, deliberate steps. You have caused more trouble than your entire species is worth. Sioha raised the sword and faced him with terror flooding through her veins. Knowing that she had no chance against a warrior who had spent centuries perfecting the art of killing. Give me the blade and I will make your death quick, Grantax offered. Resist and I will show you the full extent of Kethrani cruelty. No. The word came out of her mouth before she could stop it. A simple refusal that carried more weight than any speech she had ever given. No, she repeated. I will not give you the sword, and I will not stop trying to reach that chamber. And you will have to kill me if you want me to stop. Grantax laughed with genuine amusement. You cannot possibly believe you can defeat me in combat. I know I cannot, Sioha replied, and she felt a strange peace settle over her as she spoke the truth. I have no training, no strength, no skill with weapons. And you could kill me in a single heartbeat if you chose. Then why resist? Because not resisting feels worse than dying. She moved toward him with the sword raised. Not attacking, but simply walking forward as if he was not there. And she saw confusion flicker across his brutal features. He swung at her, and she felt the blade graze her arm, drawing blood that dripped onto the ancient floor. But she did not stop walking. He struck again, and she stumbled, but kept moving. The broadcast chamber doors visible now at the end of the corridor. Why do you not fall? Grantax roared as he struck her a third time. Why do you keep moving? Because humans do not stop. Sioha gasped through the pain. We reach for things we cannot grasp. We fight battles we cannot win. We hope for things that will never happen. She reached the doors and slammed her palm against the control panel. And to her amazement, they opened before her touch. That is our curse, she said as she stumbled into the broadcast chamber. And that is our gift. She activated the transmission array just as Grantax burst through the doors behind her. And suddenly her image was being broadcast to every world in the Galactic Concord. Billions of beings across thousands of star systems saw a battered human holding the blade of unification with blood running down her arms and defiance burning in her eyes. And for the first time in 12,000 years, the prophecy of the architects seemed possible. The alarms wailed through the temple corridors as Nazith pressed herself against the wall and peered through the doorway with fear etched across her ancient features. Grantax has brought his entire war band, she said grimly. He means to take the sword by force and destroy you before the council can legitimize your claim. Sioha rose from the bed with the blade of unification still gripped in her hands and felt a strange calm settle over her despite the chaos erupting around them. Where is Ambassador Cho? She asked. Being held in another part of the temple, Nazith replied. But there are loyalists who follow me rather than Grantax, and I have sent word for them to protect your delegation. The sounds of fighting grew closer, and Sioha could hear the harsh battle cries of Kethrani, warriors mixed with the crackle of energy weapons and the clash of metal against metal. Why are you helping me? Sioha asked the old scholar. Your own people want me dead. Nazith turned to face her with something like desperation in her eyes. Because I have devoted my entire life to understanding the architects and their prophecy, she said. And I will not allow that prophecy to be destroyed by fools who cannot accept that it has been fulfilled in a way they did not expect. A guard appeared at the doorway, his armor scorched from battle, and he spoke rapidly to Nazith in their native language. We have a path to the archive sanctum, Nazith translated. My followers control that section of the temple, and we can shelter there while we plan our next move. They moved through the corridors in a tight group with Kethrani loyalists forming a protective circle around Sioha, and she marveled at the way the ancient temple seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied normal architecture bodies lay scattered at. intersections where fighting had already occurred. And Sioha tried not to look too closely at the still forms as she stepped over them. The archive sanctum opened before them like a cathedral of knowledge, its walls lined with crystalline storage devices that contained the accumulated wisdom of 12,000 years of study. Nazith sealed the massive doors behind them and activated security protocols that caused the walls to hum with defensive energy. "We are safe for now," she said. "But Granthax will find a way through eventually." Sioha walked among the archives and ran her fingers along the glowing crystals, each one containing secrets about the architects and their long-vanished civilization. "Tell me more about these beings who made the sword," she said. "Help me understand why they would choose someone like me." Nazith settled into a chair that seemed to have been grown rather than built and gestured for Sioha to sit across from her. "The architects ruled this galaxy millions of years before any of the current species evolved," she began. "They were beings of such power that they could reshape reality with their thoughts. Yet they chose to withdraw from existence rather than continue their dominion. Why? The text suggests that they grew tired of certainty," Nazith replied. "They had become so powerful that nothing surprised them anymore. No challenge remained. No question lacked an answer." She activated a display that showed images of vast structures floating in space, cities that spanned entire star systems, technology that seemed more like magic than science. Before they departed, they left behind certain artifacts imbued with their essence. Nazith continued. The Blade of Unification was the most significant of these, a tool designed to identify a being worthy of leading the younger races toward a better future. But why would they value the ability to act without certainty? Sioha asked. "That seems like a weakness, not a strength." Nazith smiled for the first time since Sioha had met her. "To the architects, it was the greatest strength of all," she said. "They had lost that capacity through their evolution into godlike beings, and they mourned its absence." She leaned forward with intensity. "Consider how the other species in the Concord approached the sword today," she said. "The crystalline giants calculated the force required to lift the blade and applied exactly that amount, no more and no less. And when their calculations proved insufficient, they had nothing more to give, because they only tried as hard as they believed they could succeed." "Precisely," Nazith said. "Their certainty limited them. Their knowledge of their own capabilities became a cage that prevented them from exceeding those capabilities." Sioha looked down at the sword in her hands and remembered the moment she had reached for it. The absolute conviction that nothing would happen mixed with the inexplicable need to try anyway. "Humans do not calculate our chances before we act," she said slowly. "We reach for things we know we cannot grasp, and sometimes you grasp them anyway," Nazith finished. "That is what the architects valued. That is what they lost. And that is what they hoped would one day return to the galaxy through the Worthy One." A massive impact shook the archive. Sanctum and dust fell from the ceiling as the defensive shields flickered under the assault. "Granthax has brought siege weapons," a guard reported grimly. "The doors will not hold for much longer." Sioha stood and faced the sealed entrance with the sword held ready. Though she had no training in combat and knew that she would be no match for a Kathrani warrior, "There is another way," Nazith said urgently. "A passage that leads to the temple's central broadcast chamber. From there a message can be sent to every world in the Concord simultaneously." "What good would that do?" "If the galaxy sees you holding the sword, if they hear you speak, then killing you becomes much more complicated," Nazith explained. "Granthax wants to destroy you quietly and claim the sword was never truly lifted. But he cannot do that if billions of beings witness the truth." Another impact shook the chamber, and cracks appeared in the ancient walls. "We need to move now," a guard said. Nazith led them to a hidden panel in the back of the archive, and revealed a narrow passage that descended into darkness. "This path has not been used in centuries," she said, "but it should still lead to the broadcast chamber." Seoha took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness, trusting that somehow she would find her way through behind her. The doors of the archive sanctum finally gave way, and Grantax's warriors poured into the chamber with weapons raised and blood in their eyes. But their target had already vanished into the secret heart of the temple. The chamber erupted into chaos as Kethrani guards rushed toward Seoha with their weapons drawn and their voices raised in a language she did not understand. Though the hostility in their tones needed no translation, she lowered the sword slowly, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. And she raised her other hand in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I did not mean to cause offense," she said, her voice barely steady. "I do not know what happened." Prime Ascendant Velthorix pushed through the circle of guards and stopped before her with his yellow eyes burning like twin suns in his scarred face. And for a long moment, he simply stared at the blade in her hands. "This is not possible," he said in a voice that trembled with something between rage and awe. "You are human. You are nothing. You cannot be the one." More beings flooded into the temple as word of the impossible event spread through the complex. And soon the chamber was filled with representatives from every delegation who had attended the ceremony. Ambassador Cho fought his way through the crowd and placed himself between Seoha and the nearest guards. His diplomatic training the only thing keeping his composure intact. "My attach has committed no crime," he declared loudly. She merely touched a relic that has been touched by thousands before her. She lifted it, a Kethrani elder said from the edge of the crowd, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "In 12,000 years, no being has lifted the blade of unification. And now this child of a primitive world holds it in her hands." The elder stepped forward, and the crowd parted before her with obvious respect. And Seoha recognized from her research that this must be High Keeper Nazith. The most learned scholar of the architects in the entire Concord. Nazith studied Seoha with eyes that held more curiosity than hostility. And she reached out a clawed hand toward the sword. "May I?" she asked. Seoha nodded and held out the blade. And Nazith wrapped her ancient fingers around the handle and attempted to lift it from the human's grasp. The sword did not move. "Fascinating," Nazith murmured as she released her grip. "It responds only to her. The bond has already formed." "This is blasphemy." A harsh voice cut through the murmuring crowd, and a massive Kethrani warrior pushed his way to the front with murder in his eyes. The architects would never choose such a weak and insignificant creature to fulfill the prophecy. "Warlord Grantax," Nazith said calmly, "the sword has made its choice. Whether you accept it or not is irrelevant." "I do not accept it," Grantax snarled. "And I demand that this human be executed for desecrating our most sacred relic." The word execution sent ice through Seoha's veins, and she gripped the sword tighter without thinking. And she noticed that the blade seemed to pulse with warmth against her palm, as if responding to her fear. "There will be no execution," Ambassador Cho said firmly. "Ms. Yoon is under the protection of the human delegation, and, by extension, the Galactic Concord itself. The Concord has no authority on Varthka." Grantax replied with a cool smile. "This is Kethrani's sacred ground, and we will deal with the blasphemer as our traditions demand." The tension in the chamber reached a breaking point as Kethrani guards exchanged uncertain glances between their Prime Ascendant and the Warlord. Their loyalties clearly divided. Velthorix raised a hand for silence, and the room fell quiet. Every being present waiting for his judgment. "The human will be detained within the temple while we determine the truth of this matter," he declared. "No harm will come to her until the Council of Keepers has rendered its verdict." "That is not acceptable," Grantax growled. "That is my command," Velthorix replied with steel in his voice. Challenge me if you dare, warlord, but know that the consequences will be severe. The two Kethrani stared at each other for a long moment before Granthax lowered his eyes and stepped back. His submission temporary, but clear guards escorted Sioha to a small chamber deep within the temple, and Ambassador Cho was permitted to accompany her. Though they were both warned that any attempt to leave would be met with lethal force, the room was sparse but not uncomfortable, with smooth walls that glowed with the same gentle light as the main chamber, and a simple bed carved from stone. "What have I done?" Sioha whispered as she sat on the bed with the sword still clutched in her hands. "I did not ask for this. No one asked to become the center of history," Cho replied gently, "but that is where you find yourself. And we must deal with the situation as it exists." Hours passed and Sioha drifted in and out an uneasy sleep. Her dreams filled with visions of light and shadow that seemed to come from somewhere outside her own mind. She woke to find High Keeper Nazith sitting in the chamber, watching her with those ancient knowing eyes. "How long have you been here?" Sioha asked. "Long enough to know that you are genuinely confused by what has happened," Nazith replied, "which tells me more than any interrogation ever could." The old Kethrani reached into her robes and withdrew a small device that projected glowing text into the air between them. Symbols in a language that Sioha could not read. "I have spent my life studying the architects," Nazith said, "and I believed I understood the criteria they established for the worthy, one who would someday lift their blade." "What criteria?" Sioha asked. "We always assumed it was about strength or wisdom or purity of spirit," Nazith replied. "But I have found a passage in the oldest text that suggests something different entirely." She manipulated the device, and the symbols rearranged themselves into new patterns. That still meant nothing to Sioha. The translation is difficult, because the architects use concepts that do not exist in modern languages, Nazith continued. "But the closest meaning I can determine is this: a spirit unbroken by the weight of certainty. I do not understand." Nazith leaned forward with intensity burning in her eyes. "You reached for the sword without believing you could lift it," she said. "Every other being who attempted to lift knew their own capabilities and calculated their chances of success. And when those calculations told them failure was likely, their spirits hesitated even as their bodies strained. But I knew I would fail," Sioha protested. "I had no doubt at all that nothing would happen." "Exactly," Nazith said, with something like wonder in her voice. "You knew you would fail, and you reached anyway, without hope and without expectation, simply because the act of reaching mattered more to you than the certainty of the outcome." Sioha stared at the sword in her hands and tried to understand what the old scholar was telling her. The architects were not seeking the strongest or the wisest. Nazith continued. "They were seeking something that most species in the Concord have evolved beyond. A trait that we consider primitive and irrational, but that your people possess in abundance." "What trait?" "The ability to act without knowing you will succeed," Nazith replied. "The willingness to try impossible things not because you believe they are possible, but because not trying feels worse than failing." Somewhere deep in the temple, alarms began to sound. Nazith rose quickly and moved toward the door, her ancient body suddenly tense with fear. "Granthax," she hissed. "He has not waited for the council." The sounds of combat echoed through the corridor outside, and Sioha understood that whatever peace had been keeping her alive was about to end.